I'm going to talk with you about unarmed civilian peacekeeping and the work of Nonviolent Peace Force and what we've learned very humbly over the last 5 years of training and sending unarmed peacekeepers to some of the most violent places in the world. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping can be a critical element of civil peace services. And I would like for you to imagine coming out of here today that Catalan could be a vital source of the recruitment and the training and the deployment of unarmed civilian peacekeepers. That Catalan could be looked to as the place that the world could count on to receive the quality kinds of trained professionals that can continue to do the peacekeeping that's necessary. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping is a recurrent vision. And it has occurred and recurred to enough of us that at this moment in history, as Kai has already pointed out, that a critical number of us are willing to devote the monetary, the intellectual, the physical resources, and indeed our lives to see that this is a tool that is available to people struggling throughout the world. Gandhi was working on the Shanti Sena, which is Sanskrit for peace army, when he was assassinated. But there are other examples of the organizing of unarmed civilian peacekeeping that precede Gandhi and clearly were practiced by people that he knew and perhaps that inspired him in the Shanti Sena. Maud Royden, the British woman, was organizing a civilian peace service in the early 1930s to take action in the Chinese-Japanese conflict. And indeed took a proposal to the League of Nations. But even before Maud Royden's, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the Pushtun leader of what is now Pakistan, organized the Kuti Kadmandars, roughly translated as the servants of God, that provided hundreds of trained unarmed civilian peacekeepers and part of the resistance to the British colonialism of that period. In the 1980s, there were a number of applications of unarmed civilian peacekeeping. In 1983, a delegation went to the northern border of Nicaragua amid the Contra War, and we're hearing from the people the consequences of that war in human terms. And during that, one of the delegates said, "Aren't you afraid that the Contra will attack now?" And the response was, "Not as long as you're here." And from that flowed Witness for Peace, the international brigadistas that deployed groups of civilian peacekeepers to the northern border of Nicaragua in areas that had been routinely attacked by the Contras by a war that was being orchestrated out of the United States Embassy in Honduras and being trained by the CIA. And those unarmed, trained volunteers for 7 years staying in villages that had been under attack, prevented further attacks on those villages over a 7-year period. During that same era, Peace Brigades International was developed and practiced accompaniment, unarmed bodyguards in El Salvador and Guatemala. And from this, we saw a growing understanding that civilian accompaniment and presence could protect civilians. Most of these areas, or most of these efforts in the 80s and the 90s were civilian, were ad hoc, had very little training. For example, I went to the northern border of Nicaragua in early 1984 after receiving 2 hours of training in the basement of a church. We also found that most of the people who were engaging in this kind of activity came from the global north. These civilian-based peacekeeping efforts extended into the 1990s with the Balkan peace teams, with the Ecumenical Monitoring Project in South Africa, with Cry Justice in Haiti, and a variety of other efforts, again, that were primarily ad hoc, relying on volunteers, but the experience in the field was growing, and that was translating into training and preparing people to be much more effective. So what is unarmed peacekeeping? Johan Galtung defines peacekeeping as to control the actors so they at least stop destroying things, others, and themselves. Liam Mahoney, in his study for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue that Rolf has already referenced, further refines it by talking about civilian protectors are trained field staff who combine multiple strategies to influence the dynamic of violence against civilians on the ground. And the key elements are both external in terms of projection internationally and locally. And the activities are strategically targeted at changing behavior. I want to emphasize that we are not human shields. We are not doing this work to be martyrs. We are implemented, field-tested, proven strategies that have been shown to protect people and save lives in the midst of extreme violence. Our unarmed peacekeepers with Nonviolent Peace Force are well-trained field staff who use those variety of strategies to protect civilians, to deter violence, and most importantly, to create the space for local people to be able to work on peace, human rights defense, and reconciliation, and to stay alive in the process. We started doing the feasibility study on what would become Nonviolent Peace Force in the year 2000. Donna was one of the researchers. And I wish that we could talk a couple of hours about what we learned. Simultaneously, we were spending time in some of the most violent places in the world, learning from the people that were living and working there. And if I could just share two things that we learned. Number one, no one else creates anyone else's peace for them. That's the job of local people. Secondly, in the most violent places in the world today, and this goes for this very moment, there are creative and courageous peace-building efforts that are being undertaken. And more often than not, cross-culturally, that work is being led by women. And what those women told us time and time again is isolation kills us. If there's not a consequence to our death, we're much more likely to be disappeared. So today, our peacekeepers are professional, well-trained, nonpartisan. We only go at the invitation of well-rooted local groups. We are proactive. And in terms of the emphasis on a culture of peace that Ambassador Chaudhary talked about earlier, our peacekeepers are heroic. Often that heroism means patience and relationship building.